Okay, checking the mic. How's the mic doing?
Yeah, so hold it to turn it off and then.
Okay, hi everyone. We're gonna go ahead and get started. So I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, who is Dan Jarofsky. He's a professor of linguistics, of computer science, and he's also the Jackson Ellie Reynolds Professor in Humanities at Stanford University. Dan's won a lot of awards for his work and is a member of a variety of organizations. So this includes the 2002 MacArthur Fellowship. He's a member of the Academy, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the Association for Computational Linguistics and the Linguistic Society of America, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Some of you might be familiar if you've taken an intro to NLP class with his textbook, Speech and Language Processing, which he co-authored with Jim Martin, or you also might have seen his massively open online course in natural language processing, which he co-created with Chris Manning. On some of the less academic side, Dan also has a book, The Language of Food, A Linguistic Reads the Menu. And this was an international bestseller and a finalist for the 2015 James Beard Award. Dan's students will study topics in all areas of NLP, including social implications and its applications to cognitive and social sciences. As a former postdoc with Dan, one of the things I can personally attest to that all of the people who work with him really appreciate is how much enthusiasm he brings not only to every project and every meeting, but even every email exchange. So let's all welcome Dan.
Angelique, for the lovely introduction. And thanks for having me, everybody. This is very fun. So I want to talk about two really interdisciplinary projects. And from an NLP perspective, we could think of these as applications of NLP or collaborations involving NLP. One involving police body-worn cameras and one involving political discourse and immigration. So let me start with the body-worn camera. And just to give you an idea of what I mean by interdisciplinary, I've color-coded all the people who've worked on this project over the years, including Angeli, in fact. So in green are the computer scientists, and in blue are the social psychologists, and in red are the linguists, and in black are the electrical engineers. So this is a very collaborative bunch of people from many disciplines. And it's led by my colleague in the building next door, Jennifer Aberhart, who's a social psychologist. And she's worked on policing and bias for many years. And this project, like many fun projects, started when she came to me and said, I have this amazing data, but I need someone to look at the language and computational aspects of it. And so we started collaborating. And it's been 10 years this year. Okay, so the problem begins with this thing that you all know about, which is that Black Americans have long reported more negative interactions with the police and unfair stops by the police. And you've all seen, I'm sure, videos like the George Floyd killing showing inappropriate police officer use of force. And our idea in starting this collaborations was to see if speech and language processing could help in some way. Could we measure problems in police community interactions? Could we detect escalation before it happens? Could we maybe even design interventions of some sort? And the fundamental idea is to think about body-worn camera as data rather than as evidence in court to be shown, only in a trial. So that would mean look at lots of body camera data, look at it in everyday common interactions. And the fundamental political or justice system idea that we draw on is this idea called procedural justice. So procedural justice is the idea that the system of justice should strive for two things, not just equitable outcomes, which obviously it should strive for, but also an equitable process. So that means that the process, including the interpersonal treatment, we should strive for equity. So for example, a person who's treated with respect, there's lots of research showing that they tend to have more trust in the fairness of a police officer who they're interacting with and the institution of policing more generally. So respect is this idea from procedural justice. So we began our study by asking about respect. And so we the first thing we do is look at these body camera data and ask whether police officers treat Black community members with a different degree of respect than white community members. And this, I'll try to show you who led each of the projects. And Rob Voigt, who's now in the linguistics department at Northwestern, led this one. So for this project, so we've worked with various departments over the years, and this is from the first department we worked with. So we took 1 month of data, 1 month of body camera data. There's about 17,000 interactions in 1 month, and took 1,000 what we call everyday interactions. So only vehicle stops. So the person is a driver and the officer stops them. Only things in which there's a warning or citation. So it's the normal thing where you get stopped for speeding or running a red light or making an illegal right turn. Nobody gets arrested, no searches, no warrants, none of that kind of stuff. So everyday interactions, 240 different officers. And then we had every stop professionally transcribed. I'll get to speech recognition by the end, but at the beginning, everything, and really still, everything has to be transcribed. And that's a huge pain because police departments require that anybody who looks at the data, so every transcriber and every grad student and every faculty has to go to the department, get background check, have their fingerprints sent to Washington, wait 2 months. So it's a huge, enormous hassle. It's also, I can talk about the data issues, but data can't, the audio can't leave the server, so transcribers have to see a bitmap of the video, and it's a huge hassle. And then we started with really relatively simple classifiers for linguistics properties of these interactions. And as you'll see I'll talk about 5 or 6 papers that are all published in this space. And you'll see from the beginning, they started out with classical NLP things where there's a logistic regression and there's some hand-built features. And by the end, we're at prompting large language models. So this is an early study. So here's what we did. We had humans hand label sentences for how respectful the officer was, that you see like a snippet of the interaction, and then you say, Likert scale 1 to 5, how respectful is this utterance? And we also had humans label sentences for dialogue structure. I'll talk about that. And then we just built standard classifiers, logistic regression classifiers. How respectful is this sentence? What dialogue act is going on right here? So here's the kind of results. Here's what the humans were asked. How respectful was the officer in this sentence? They see a sentence, they see everything that happened right before, and we take the human responses, and I won't talk about this, and look at the first 2 principal components. And roughly what we found is in these 400 hand-labeled data points, officers seem more respectful to white drivers, equally formal to white and black drivers, but clearly more respectful to white drivers. That's just 400 utterances. So we'd like to build classifiers and run it on lots of data. So how do we get features for these classifiers for lots of data? I'm just going to show you the underlying social theory underlying some of the features. And the idea is called face. And it was developed originally by sociologist Irvin Goffman, but then kind of worked out in detail by Lakoff and Brown and Levinson. And the idea of face is that everybody has 2 kinds of face, positive face and negative face. And they're really terrible names, but whatever. We're stuck with them, kind of. Academics is a very conservative discipline. So positive face is that everybody wants to be valued. We want to be part of your group, and we want to be valued by you. Negative face is we want to be autonomous and we want to be independent, not be bothered. And so politeness evolved to deal with these 2 kinds of faces, politeness across cultures. So positive politeness is the kind of politeness where you emphasize the value of the other person, you emphasize our good relationship. So that's positive politeness. Maybe that's the kind that we think of kind of intuitively as politeness. Saying please and saying nice things to people. Negative politeness is when you're commanding someone to do something, you want to minimize the imposition on that person. So if I said, Anjali, stand up, that's extremely rude. I've threatened her. That's her negative face has been threatened, her autonomy of sitting there. But if I said, oh, Anjali, I'm so sorry, I dropped my pencil under your chair. Would you mind just moving over just a little bit? Now I've minimized the imposition. I put on record that it's in, I've done all these things. So that's negative politeness. Or positive politeness is, oh, I love your purse. That's or a wonderful thing you said the other day. That's positive politeness. Okay, so police do this kind of things, and we can measure this too. So positive politeness, you could call somebody by a formal title. You could introduce yourself to them. So you care about your relationship with them. So you say who you are. You could talk about sympathy. You could mention safety. Please drive safely. I care about your safety. That's a way of showing positive politeness. Negative politeness, the officers are making the driver stop and do things and giving them a ticket. So you could apologize, you could thank the drivers, you could do a lot of minimization of the problem. You could say, oh, it's okay, don't worry, I just need you to sign this thing. And you can use these lovely linguistic things, just a little kind of little minimization things. And we had in previous research shown that you could measure politeness in various ways. And just to show you one result from an earlier paper, we found that power corrupts. So if you measure the politeness of Wikipedia editors right before an admin election, they're really polite. And right after the election, politeness plummets. The people who don't get elected get much more polite right after the election. So they figured out they should have been polite, but it's too late. Yeah. Okay, and then just to give you the Linguistic Institute from dialogue labeling, this is an old idea that many of you will know, but Wittgenstein first said that when we're having a conversation, the things we're doing, each turn in the dialogue is an action that we're performing, and that got taken up by other philosophers like Austin and Searle. And then Barbara Gross, one of the early pioneers of natural language processing, did her thesis on dialogue in the 70s. First pointed out that when you're doing a task of any sort with somebody else and there's a conversation about the task, the structure of the conversation mirrors the structure of the task. So what does that mean? So for example, here's a piece of a transcript of an officer stopping a male driver. And so in blue is what the officer is saying, and that's going to be the thing we're going to study mostly at the beginning of what I'm talking about. And the officer's doing certain things by their linguistic actions. So they're greeting the person. This is them giving the reason for the stop. We'll come back to this a lot because giving a reason for the stop turns out to be really important. This is the officer asking about details like their address and things they've got to fill out a form. So the officer's job is to either give them a warning or give them a citation, let them off with a warning or give them a ticket. The officer's job has to fill in the form. The officer has to give the person the reason. So the officer's requirements for their job kind of mirror the set of linguistic things that are going on. So we call these institutional dialogue acts, and we're going to want to detect those as well. So we had humans label a bunch of these dialogue acts. And it turns out that, as I intimated, dialogue structure has policy implications. So departments require officer to give the reason for the stop very commonly. And in California, in fact, it's now the law as of January that the officers must tell you why they stopped you when they stop you. So they have to say something like, the reason I pulled you over is when you passed me, you were texting. So we'd like to know, are officers doing this? And if they don't do that, it's important to know whether this is causing problems or not. Another issue related to dialogue acts is that Black community members experience these investigatory questions like, is this your car? And do you live here? So could we quantify these kind of investigatory questions to see if there's a racial difference in these questions? So we end up with a couple of simple classifiers. So this is a classifier that takes a sentence, assigns a number, respect level, and using features. And here's the kind of feature. So here's a pretty respectful sentence that apologizes and introduces themselves. And here's another one that's even more respectful that calls the person ma'am and talks about their safety and so on. And similarly, we can build classifiers that can label dialogue acts. And at the time, again, this was all done with old-fashioned classifiers, and now you can do this with prompting. We've had actually very good luck with prompting for getting dialogue acts. But so we can figure out, where are the reasons and where's the officer asking for documents and all the things the officer is doing. So now we can ask whether are there racial differences in these linguistic things officers are doing. And the way we test for this is run a big regression. It's what linguists and computer scientists call mixed effects regressions and what social scientists call hierarchical regressions, because you can't just run a simple regression because it's the same officer, it has multiple stops. So you do this complicated thing with random intercepts for the stops and so on. And I'm going to give you the answer, and then I'll talk about confounds. You should always be thinking about confounds when you're dealing with social science. So is there an effect of race across this 1,000 stops, these 36,000 sentences in the 1,000 stops? Yes. So officers are indeed more respectful to white drivers. They're also more respectful to older drivers, which is good for me since I'm getting older, but they're also more respectful to me because I'm white, which is bad. And they also use more appropriate dialogues with white drivers. I'll give you some examples. So officers tend to be more positively polite to white drivers. They're more likely to call them by sir or ma'am. they're much more likely to talk about the safety of white drivers. So here's a great thing for an officer to say. I just want you and your baby to be safe. That is exactly what you would want a police officer to say to somebody, but it's not good that they say it to white drivers and not to black drivers. Same with negative politeness. So more reassurance and downplaying for white drivers. So the no problems and the don't worry. And you can see this utterance, the officers just prove that this officer is kind of stumbling all over themselves to minimize the problem, which is, again, great. This is exactly what you want the officer is not for people to be confused or alarmed. And but again, we don't want a racial difference there. And then what happens more with black drivers is these legitimacy questions. Why are you here? Why are you in this neighborhood? Is this your car? Okay, I want to talk about the second problem we talked about, which is escalation. So this project was led by Eugenia Rowe, who's at Virginia Tech in the computer science department now. And so the first paper I talked about focused on average, everyday, everything. But our goal is to keep people from being killed. We'd like to stop escalated stops. And there's been lots of calls for police to de-escalate encounters, and departments in general are trying to think about how they could get less violence in traffic stops. So we look at how escalation happens. And again, body cameras provide this amazing new tool for looking at that. So for this paper, we defined escalation. Nobody was shot, luckily, in our data. So escalation means somebody was arrested or somebody was handcuffed or somebody was searched. But otherwise, these are normal traffic stops. So there was not a warrant or a car chase. It was the person was stopped for a traffic reason or for some officer seeing some traffic thing. And then after stopping them, the stop escalated. And what we do is look for the first 45 words, which is about 30 seconds of the stop. So the very beginning of the stop. And what we found, I'm summarizing the whole paper in just one slide. What we found is that when a stop escalates, you can see it in the first 45 words. So the officers are much less likely to give a reason for the stop when the stop escalates. And what they do instead is start the stop with an order. So when officers begin with an order and don't give a reason, things go awry. And then we used a language model to just predict, is escalation going to happen, just by using it the first 45 words. So we know from this regression that there's likely to be differences. And now we just ask if a language model can find the same thing. And it can do pretty well at predicting whether a stop's going to escalate. And if we use integrated gradients to just discover in the model what kind of features it's using, it turns out it's picking up on this fact that escalated stops begin with orders and don't tend to have reasons. And what this all suggests is that the word escalated is maybe the wrong word. We think about these things as if something happens in the interaction that causes it to go bad. But what this suggests is from the beginning, there's something going on. The stop's beginning in a bad way. So this changes how we need to think about these escalated stops. So whenever I'm learning as a linguist and a computer scientist working with social scientists, that whenever you have any result, you have to ask, could it be caused by some confounding variable? And there's lots of confounding variables. So we looked at a lot of them, and they're all in this big regression, and I want to walk you through some of them. So because a confound is a hypothesis that your result could have been caused by something else, not in our case, race. So could all these facts about officers, differences in how they talk to black versus white drivers, be caused by something that is not race? So here's a confound from a hypothesis. Maybe officers are nervous when they're in high crime neighborhoods. When they're nervous, they're less respectful. And maybe black people are more likely to live in high crime neighborhoods than white people. So what we want to do is control for neighborhood when testing if there's an effective race. And luckily, we have crime rates for all the neighborhoods in the city we ran this study in, and there is no effective neighborhood at all, no effect of the crime rate. So that can't be the reason why police are less respectful to black drivers. Okay, maybe here's a different confound hypothesis. Maybe white drivers are stopped for more minor offenses, black drivers are stopped for more severe offenses, the officer is more annoyed at the black drivers for committing the more severe offenses, and so they're less respectful. So to test this hypothesis, we hired officers and we paid them to label our stops for how severe the infraction was that the person, the driver committed, from very minor, the officers made up the scale, from very minor, like having expired registration, to very serious, like speeding. And so if this was causing our effect instead of race, we would expect that black drivers would be committing more severe offenses. But we found the opposite, that it's white drivers who actually commit more severe offenses. And this is something that's known in the literature, that black drivers tend to be stopped for more minor things. Maybe the difference is because that, remember I said that we started by having 400 sentences labeled by a bunch of raters, and then we trained our logistic regression models on that. Maybe it's because those raters, in the early days, people did psychology studies on, college freshmen. Now everybody does it online. But this was like right at the end of when people did it with college freshmen. So we replicated that lab study. So suppose you want to have a perfect demographic match of the drivers of a city. You want to know, you want their race, their age, you want an exact perfect sample that matches drivers of a city. Where would you go to get your sample? The DMV, yes. And the DMV has this great advantage, which is, which I won't say out loud what the problem is with the DMV, but people are very happy to get a little extra money for doing a study. And so we replicated the original study asking how respectful is this sentence from this officer. And it's still the case that sentences that were spoken to white drivers, although the subjects didn't know the race of the driver, were rated as more respectful. Question. Pardon? Oh, so sorry. It's a Department of Motor Vehicles. Sorry, that's the place where you get driver's licenses in this state. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, you go to the place where the drivers are.
That by participant race, you mean labeler's race?
Labeler's race. Yeah, yeah. So people who are labeling the sentences for how respectful they are, again, because it's an exact snapshot of the demographics of drivers. They can be every age, they can be every race, and those neither age nor race affects how respectful people think sentences are. People seem to agree on what it means for an officer to be respectful across demographics. Other questions while I'm stopped? Yes.
Is there an effort to mask the race of the person who did stop when they're doing these annotations?
Yes. Oh, yeah. They have no idea what they see a transcript. So they see the driver said X. Driver says X. Officer says Y. Driver says X. Now officer says Y. How respectful is this officer? In a transcript. So they know nothing about the race of the driver or the officer. There could be linguistic cues. We, in creating the data, didn't see race in there, but it would be a good counter study to double check that it's for sure impossible to see race in the transcripts. Oh, I see. Yes, you can just look at what the officer is saying. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, in general, we didn't have in our data or in this sample a lot of, so we're actually interested in looking at African-American English. So are drivers who speak African-American English more likely to receive disparate treatment from the officer? In this particular study, we didn't pick out the African-American English. So I think it would be hard for the subjects to know, but you're right that we should check it. That's a good one. All right.
Can you, can automatically the race of the driver be understood from the transcript?
I don't think so.
Have we tried?
We haven't tried. And so first of all, how do we define race? We define race as whatever the officer thought the person was. So I don't really care what race they actually are, because I'm asking about how officers treat people they think are black. So all we care about is what the officer thinks the person is. We have no absolute truth of the person's race. So all we know is what the officer said the person wrote down on the form. But yeah, I guess we could check to see, well, in some sense, I'm telling you, you can predict the race of the person from the officer's language because they're less respectful. Yeah. So yes, that task is doable. Yeah, in that sense. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you did like coding of the speech from the officers. Did you also do that with the drivers?
Yes, hold that thought. We're just starting a bunch of work on the driver, and I'll say a few things about the driver. Yeah, excellent question. Oh, luckily, it's the next slide. So we're still studying, we're still a bunch, I don't have a strong answer to this yet, but I'll show you our first answer, which is here's a plot of officer respect to white drivers and black drivers. So in yellow, the top line, respect to white drivers. So the y-axis is respect, and then the x-axis is all the stops normalized into 0 to 100 time. And you can see that from the very, very beginning, there's a significant difference between respect levels. So officers are respectful to white drivers at the very, very beginning. And we saw that again in our study on escalation, that from the very beginning, officers are more respectful to white drivers. So although you could imagine it being the case that something black driver says affects officer respect, it's there already at the beginning. And in general, respect gets higher over the course of the interaction as the officer gets a little less nervous. So that seems unlikely. But what we're doing now is we're actually coding all the driver language. Jason.
I noticed that there's a dip in the middle in both of these, and you said that might be because the officer is getting more comfortable, but because it lowers and then rises again, I wonder if it also has something to do with task structure, where they're trying to begin and end on a good note, but then they do the hard stuff in the middle. And so I wonder if some of the difference might be because there is a compound from what they're talking to the driver about.
Yeah, that could well be. I mean, both of them have kind of a dip or about a quarter of the way. I don't know if this dip is significant really, but there might be some kind of dip here, and it's possible that I like your hypothesis. They're kind of a little more polite here, and then they have to deal with the fact that they're giving the person a ticket, and then by the end they're sort of getting along. Yeah, I buy it. Other questions while we're stopped? Okay. All right, here's another confound. Well, we only looked at words when we asked people to say how polite utterances were. Shouldn't we be looking at tone of voice? So here's what we did for tone of voice. And this project was led by Nick Camp, who's in the Organizational Studies Department at Michigan. So we take officer speech, we take 10-second tiles of it, and we low pass filter them. So low pass filtered data is like Charlie Brown adult speech. Sounds like that. And now we have people listen to that and say, how respectful was that officer? How friendly was that officer? And once again, no words, just from the tone of voice, officers are rated as more respectful when talking to white drivers. And if you listen to this, you can hear sort of what's going on. Black drivers are more likely to go, rah, 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 and to white drivers are more likely to go, rah, rah, rah. And so just looking at a subset of those sentences where they're giving the reason, yeah, the officers are rated as more respectful when they're quieter, they're using lower pitch, they're slower, they're doing less of these strong final falls that I was imitating. And they're doing more of that to white drivers. And then Nick asked people this sort of high-level question. If you're listening to officers, ask people listening to officer speech, they don't know if they're talking to black versus white drivers, and ask them, how much does this officer care about the community? How much would you trust this department? If the subjects who listened to officers talking to black drivers thought the police cared less about that community. So this is important for police relations. Okay, another thing I'm learning from working with social scientists is, as a computer scientist, I'm used to just measuring things. I can build analytic tools to measure stuff, but they want to fix things, and so that's really great. So I'm trying to learn to think that way. How can we actually make the world better, and not just measure the awfulness of the world? And so in this paper, which is about to appear, led by Nick, we looked at training. And so here's what we did. We used our respect models to find very good interactions and very bad interactions, and then created a really good conversation and a really bad conversation. And the department basically did a skit with a good way to interact and a bad way to interact, and built a procedural justice training involving those skits, and also a set of tips, that came out of the study, like state the reason for the stop, offer reassurance, in general, bias training is very difficult and hasn't worked well. And what we tried to do, or what the trainers tried to do in this study, was solve some of the problems in earlier bias training. So this has a lot of advantages. One is the data that you're training them on came from their speech. So you or one of your compatriots said the following things in this bad stop, and you or one of your fellow officers said this good thing in this good stop. Doesn't this sound better for you? So the data is drawn exactly from their own speech. And the tips are extremely specific, and they can see them in the good examples, and they all agree that those are better ways to speak. So, and indeed, if you look at, we looked at 122 officers a month before and a month after training, and officers are indeed more likely to give the reason for the stop, more likely to offer reassurance, and more likely to mention driver safety. So that's very exciting. Okay, everything up until now. Oh, yes, question, yes. Excellent question. Yes, I have a slide. I could find it if we need to, but the essential answer is there is no variance among officers. So if you look at race of officers, and how the officers, how polite, let's say the x-axis is politeness, where this is more polite and this is more polite to white drivers, more polite to black drivers, and you look at race of officers, you see this beautiful Gaussian shifted toward the white drivers, but no big bumps for individual officers. So it's not a story of a few bad apples. Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, all officers are just nicer to white people. Here, yes. So, but only a 2-month longitudinal study. So, you mean across one dialogue or over years? No. That's a great question. Like, I mean, this is our first question where we had a particular exogenous variable, the training, to see if things change. But we'd like to look at, for example, what happens when there's an officer-involved shooting? What happens when an officer is shot? They were very interested in that question. And correct. And so so we're in the middle of that. So we're in the middle of getting large amounts of data from multiple departments, and it's large. We had to buy 20 huge disk drives because it's video, and it turns out to be high-res video. So yes, we would love to answer that question. That's like the social scientists on our team exactly want to answer that question. Yeah. Yes, and then. They knew that they were being recorded. This is a big part of their day. At the end of every day, they take their body cameras, and so they knew they're being recorded, and they were told that there was going to be a study. Yeah.
That you mentioned for the police officers' race. So have you looked at the police officers' race corresponding to the driver's race? That there will be like
Great question. So does the officer's race affect respect, or does homophily between the officer's race and the driver's race affect respect? No, neither. There's no effect whatsoever of either. So all the officers are all more respectful to white drivers, irrespective of their race. There is no gender effect. We expected to see a gender effect. Officers are not more respectful to women. They are more respectful. There's an age effect, but not a gender effect.
The location of the police department used for the study make a difference to this?
We don't know. So basically, this study was one department, and we have data from other departments, and we're just starting to study those. So we don't know. No, it's a great question. Like, so you're asking a hypothesis about another confound. Could it be that that all these facts, all these findings about officers treating white and black drivers differently, maybe it's caused by, maybe officers only treat poor people badly and not black people, and there's a correlation between being poor and being black in America. So we don't know that. And that it'd be very hard to tell, and it'd be extremely hard to tease up in America, very hard to tease apart race and socioeconomic class, especially given that what do you know about them? You know about their car, which is known to correlate with race very strongly. So it'd be very hard to do. I think it's a good question, hard to operationalize, in the back. I see. No, there is no interaction with race and age. Yeah. Yeah, so it's officers are just respectful to old people, but not, that doesn't cause the lack of respect to black people. Yeah. Also the back row. Oh no, this is all published data, so it's all very significant and replicated in all these different ways with these different compounds. So yeah, these are significant results.
Yeah. So does you have like information about the car model or not?
We do not have information about the car. So it turns out, just for whatever reason, that car information is not linked to these when they do a traffic stop, they don't record the car. I don't know why. It'd be interesting to look at the car. Car could tell you something about socioeconomic class, but the problem is in America, car type is extremely strongly linked to race. So you can predict people's race from the car they drive. So again, it's very hard to tease apart race and socioeconomic class in America. Yeah. Other questions in the back? The officers, no, we don't know that. Yeah. That does seem likely, yeah. Was there one over here, Jason?
Yeah, there's just maybe a longer question, but after training, did you also look at the interactions using the same metrics you had before to make sure that they were more respectful?
Yes. Oh, did we do respect? Did we study respect? No.
Succeeds, like it actually.
No, because we didn't tell them to be more respectful. We told them to do these things.
Right, but did that turn into more respect? Like you can imagine they're more likely to mention driver safety and then compensate by being more disrespectful and other things.
I see.
Just a usual question.
No, it's a reasonable question. I don't remember whether we even measured respect on the old measure or not. Yeah. Other questions?
How do you decide how to process the audio to make the Charlie Brown speech?
Oh, how do you why low pass filters? That's just why do we pick 500 hertz? What you do is you keep widening the window until people can't tell what the words are, or narrowing. Yeah, widening the window until they can tell what the words are and then back off. Yeah. Yeah, narrowing the window until they can tell what the words are and then back up. Yeah. Okay, so in a project that Anjali did when she was a postdoc, we're trying to address the problem that we're hiring these human transcribers, which is, expensive. I mean, like probably we've spent over the course of this project, I don't know, $60,000, $70,000 on transcription, maybe $100,000. It's a lot of money. So what we'd like to do is do automatic transcription. So what Anjali looked at, and you can ask Anjali to talk about it more, was she did many things, but I'm just giving a kind of a quick summary of what she did, is fine-tune Whisper, which is one of the best current available speech recognizers, fine-tune it on the speech data, and then how good are the transcriptions, given that you've got a fine-tune Whisper? And if you're given hand alignments, meaning I tell you where the speech starts and where the speech stops and say, give me the words inside that window, you can do speech recognition of officer speech. It is solvable. 13%, it's like reasonable enough to do a lot of things with 13% error. But even if you tell it where the community members start talking and where they stop talking, you cannot do speech recognition of community member speech. It's too hard. They're not near the microphone. They're not always face to the microphone. They're behind a window. Even if the window is rolled down, it's just very hard to hear them. If instead we try to do automatic diarization to decide who talks when and then run speech recognition, you get error rates that are unusable. So basically from this first study, what Anjali found is that the hardest problem is really diarization, and off-the-shelf methods of diarization don't work, and transcription can't work until it can also solve the diarization problem. And Whisper can do some diarization. So I think Anjali believes it'll just get better. We all hope, I think it'll just get better. And yes, Moran. Well,
Like interlabelers.
we don't have interlabeler agreement on transcription. Yeah, so really once speech recognition gets good enough that we're starting to compare it to humans, which it's not, then you're right, we're going to need to get that. For what we got for our $100,000 was single transcripts for all. But you're right, we're going to need that. We're going to need that. Yeah. Other questions about speech? Okay, and what Anjali and her student Jamie are doing now with Paula and I'm helping is try to create some public data. All this data is extremely private in the fingerprinting and everything, but there is public data because departments upload body camera footage when there's somebody gets shot or other kinds of critical incidents. So they're on YouTube. You can find them. So Anjali's idea is, could you create a data set out of these? And that's work in progress. Okay, so in summary, for the first project, I want to talk about white drivers black drivers and white drivers are treated differently. White drivers are spoken to with more respect, have concern for their safety expressed. Black drivers spoken to less respect, have their legitimacy challenged about why they're where they are. Escalated stops of black drivers seem to begin an escalation, and we can measure all this with NLP and maybe help improve officer training. But we still have enormous technological challenges with this kind of dirty data. Christine?
Is there other response to either the transcription or like maybe assessing the politeness of using the language model as a judge? How would you control for like the bias in the language model, I guess, for example, either in the quality of the speech recognition or in like the assessment?
No, it's a great question. Yeah, so we know from an earlier paper that was led by Alison Koenigke at Stanford that transcription algorithms are biased against African-American speech. So the word error rate is higher for African-Americans than for non-African-Americans. And some speech recognizers have trained on African-American data since our finding was from 2020. And since then, a bunch of African-American English has been added to training sets. So it's possible that they're better, but we would have to check is the real answer. Yeah, and the same would be true if you wanted to do respect labeling. If we used any kind of model, we want to check for bias. Yeah.
Do you think it would be beneficial in like continuing your work to look at bilingualism in police officers to see if that impacts respect in any way? Just kind of having that personal experience with that.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think yeah, for looking at African-American, we want to look really carefully about at the African-American officers and to see if that makes a difference or helps. And if we were going to look at Spanish speakers, we definitely want to look at Spanish bilingual officers. I think that'd be great.
What about the native language of the person talking? Did you do any analysis of whether being a non-native English speaker impacted the respect?
No, that's a great thing we'd like to do. We don't have that labeled, but we could label that. We could hire officers to label what they think. Because again, we don't care about what's true. We care about the perception of the officer. So we could hire officers and ask them, does this person have an accent, and see if that affects things. So in the study we're going to do on African-American English, I think that's a great control sort of to look at other dialects issues. Yeah.
Did you check the time of day for traffic stop? Whether there's any
Yeah, it's a good question. We didn't check time of day. We had other covariates I haven't talked about. So we checked like the seniority of the officer. Yeah, it'd be good to check not just so time of day, but also like is the officer at the end of their shift, like complicated things like that. So there are other covariates that we could also check, and I think we keep adding more covariates as we do. At some point, you can't do any more because it's one big regression. And if you throw in an infinite number of covariates, then you can't see anything because you're modeling every data point with a covariate. But I think we could still add a few more. Yeah. Okay, I want to move on. In our last 10 minutes, I want to talk about just to say, I mentioned this California Assembly bill where officers have to state the reason for the stop. So we're going to try to measure that. We're going to look at what I said earlier. We're going to look at the driver language. So now we're doing is we're labeling the speech acts of the drivers to see what's going on with driver language. What does it mean for a driver to comply or not comply, and so on. And the recognition and diarization I talked about. Okay, I want to talk, and I'll be brief. I should stop at 1/4 after.
People have been asking you questions, so go right up to 12.
Oh, I see. Okay, I'll still try to stop early. Yeah. I think I could do this by 1/4 after, a little more. So here's a second study, which has very fewer slides, so not to panic, where some social scientists, and this was Leah Bustan and Ron Abramitsky, who are economic historians, came to us and said, oh, we want to look at how immigration is talked about in America over time. Could you help us study this? And this was led by Dallas Card, who's now at the University of Michigan, and Serena Chang, who's about to start at Berkeley. And so the question we asked was based on how attitudes toward immigration, are they the same or are they different if we look across the history of the nation? And so famously, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, at the turn of the last century, was an anti-immigrant senator. The Congress in general was very anti-immigrant, pretty much all the way from the history of the nation until the 1940s. Talks about flood of low-skilled wages, and we see the exact same kind of language from a modern senator in the 2018s. So it sounds like, well, it's just been, anti-immigration attitudes have been the standard in Congress for 120 years, but we don't really know if that's true. These are just, individual examples. So here was the idea briefly. Study the congressional record, which gives us about 140 years. It's hard, the data before 1880 is just messy. So we started in 1880. And we did 3 computational things. We looked at the change in attitudes and the rise of Democratic-Republican polarization. We looked at the kind of frames and emphases that Congress people were talking about. And we came up with a very cute algorithm for measuring dehumanizing metaphors that we use for other things now. So I'll just briefly talk about each of these. So to measure attitude, so pro-immigration versus anti-immigration, we built 2 classifiers. One to detect if a speech is about immigration, and one to detect if it's pro or anti-immigration. And those were trained by hiring lots of labelers to label lots of congressional speeches, and then we just fine-tuned a Roberta classifier to say, is this pro or anti? Is this immigration or not immigration? And then what I'm going to show you is a bunch of plots where the dependent variable is % pro versus % anti. So up means positive toward immigration, down means negative, and the middle is 0.
Lots of speeches, 1,000.
It is, I think, 1 million. It might be on the next slide. If it's not on the next, it's over 1 million, I believe. Yeah, it's a lot of speeches. So here, just to think about the data, here's the 140 years. Up means pro-immigration, down means anti-immigration for Congress. And then I'm going to show you some time points. So you can see that Congress is generally anti-immigration until somewhere around this point, which is, the late 50s. And then has been roughly positive, with some swings, roughly positive ever since. So you can see you could talk about the history of the country as the anti-immigration part and the pro-immigration part. And some pieces, so the 1882 is the Chinese Exclusion Act. So anybody from China was excluded. And in 1923, roughly everybody else was excluded. So everybody who wasn't from Western or Northern Europe, everybody else was excluded. And then in 1965, with the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 65, the quotas were repealed. So now let's look at the same graph, but with parties plotted, and you can see somewhere around in there, bless you, you can see that Democrats, so Congress becomes positive about immigration, stays that way for a while, and then somewhere Republicans go negative and Democrats kind of roughly stay constant, and with maybe a little rise here. I'm not sure that's significant. So you can see the polarization develop. Yes.
How are you defining Democrat and Republican during, say, like Reconstruction era, or when the political parties were not so defined as they are now?
Yes, I mean, so the data, they're labeled as their party. So, for example, well, just for example, Southern Democrats, like the Democratic Party shifted a lot in the South. So people who were Democratic before a certain point became Republicans and after, and that can be part of a cause of this difference, for example. But we just use the party that the person was labeled with. Yeah, meaning the party that the name of the party they used, even though the politics of the party has shifted over time. Yeah. In the early period, it doesn't matter much because everybody was anti-immigration and there was no polarization. Yeah. So again, you can see the two halves, but now we're plotting who they're talking about. Italian immigrants, Chinese immigrants, Mexican immigrants. And you can see that both at the early phase and the later phase, whether if you're anti-immigration in the early half of this 140 years, or you're pro-immigration in the second half, it's Italians are talked about more positively, next Chinese, and Mexicans the lowest, and that's been consistent across the period. So that's polarization and sentiment. We can also look at framing, and I want to just very quickly explain how we get these frames. So we take sentences and we parse them, and we come up with words that are related in the parse tree to various words for different kinds of immigrants. And then we make a lexicon with words that occur more often for immigrants than for non-immigrants, so words that are immigrant associated. So like the verb absorb or the noun flood, so with their part of speech. And then we hand curate all of these words into frames, 14 frames that all the authors hand labeled all the words for which frames they were in. And we ended up with 14 hand labeled frames. These are the frames we ended up with. So talking about immigration in terms of crime, like they are criminals, or legality, they are illegal, or they are a threat, and so on. And what you can see is there's no big difference between the parties in 1880. So to the right means more a frame used more by Republicans, to the left means a frame used more by Democrats, and you can see and the size is the amount of language with that frame. And you can see no big differences at the last turn of the century, but in this turn of the century, you can see differences develop where Republicans focus on crime, legality, and deficiency in immigration. So develop an anti-immigration way of talking, and Democrats develop a pro-immigration way of talking about the culture and the victim status, family, a refugee status, that kind of thing. And the third computational thing we developed is a way to measure metaphorical dehumanization. So there's a long linguistic literature, and I'm giving Santa Ana as an example, but there's lots of similar ideas, which are pointing out that words like flood or wave or stream are used in a dehumanizing way to talk about immigrants. So a flood of illegal immigrants streaming into the country implicitly evokes a metaphor that immigrants are catastrophic, that it's a catastrophic force, it's a force of nature, and terrible things happen. So it's a way of, without saying illegal immigrants are a terrible, destructive force of nature, you kind of imply all that in a way that's deniable. And And measuring these metaphors is useful for all sorts of things. So I want to just, if you haven't seen metaphor theory, give you like 30 seconds on metaphor theory. So, so how do we talk about arguments in English? We use words like indefensible or weak points or demolish the argument or won an argument. So the language we use shooting down arguments is the language of war. We talk about arguments as if they're a war where they're battling and there's a winner and there's a loser. You could imagine talking about arguments as if they were a dance and we were doing some structured, complicated back and forth, but we don't. This is how we talk about arguments, and that's a cultural thing we do, and we can see it in the language. Or similarly, if I say this app will save you hours, or I'm spending my time, or it's costing me an hour, we're talking about time as if it's money. Exactly. So these metaphors are ways to look at, if I want to know how do we think about hours, look at the verb, look at the neighboring words, and they should tell us something about our metaphorical attitude toward these things. So here's the idea. Lots of literature has noticed a metaphorical treatment of immigration. So talking about immigrants as if they're animals, as if they're vermin, as if they're diseases, disasters, or cargo. And then here's examples of the kind of things that you can see in the language. So the word dumping suggests that somebody is a thing to be dumped, or infect is a thing that diseases do. So given this literature, this linguistic literature pointing out these implicit metaphors, we want to measure whether Congress people are doing this, because Congress people don't tend to explicitly call people rats. So they tend to be more implicit. So instead of calling someone an animal, you'll use the word feeding, these implicit metaphorical expressions around the object. So we're going to measure those. So here's how we're going to measure them. We're going to take a text that describes an immigrant, and we're going to just remove the immigrant word, mask it out, and we're going to ask a language model to put it back. And we're going to say, what are the words you think were in that gap? Get the probability of all of them, and then look at the probability of words that are related to particular metaphors we want to measure. So if we want to know what's the probability of the cargo metaphor in this sentence, prevent the dumping of undesirable immigrants, we mask out the word immigrants, and we ask BERT or any masked model, what are the words that you think replace that mask? And we have a lexicon of words related to each metaphor. So cargo is things and goods and stuff. And we just sum all the probabilities of the things in our lexicon, and that will give us a probability of that metaphor happening. And so now we can measure for, it's like another frame. We can measure how much these 6 dehumanization metaphors are being used. And they were used equally by Republicans and Democrats at the previous turn of the century, but we can see a change in language in the last 20 years with more dehumanization metaphors by Republican Congress people. We can also see an interesting kind of homology where if you look at how people were talking, how Congress people were talking about Chinese immigrants in the era of mass migration after the Chinese Exclusion Act, how they're talking about Chinese immigrants and how Mexican immigrants are talked about today, you can see a very similar pattern. So to the right means talking more about either Mexican immigrants or Chinese immigrants using this frame, and to the left means talking more about European immigrants using this frame. And you can see that Chinese immigrants 100 years ago and Mexican immigrants now tend to be talked about in terms of being criminals and taking away jobs and their legality, and European immigrants are talked more about their contributions and being victims and contributing to our culture. And you can see the same patterns 100 years apart for these two groups. Okay, so in the summary for this half, we can see facts that are interesting, from a political science and economic history perspective, which is exactly how attitudes changed and when the polarization started to happen. You can see these interesting homologies, which lets you understand sort of attitudes toward non-European groups. And we have a new method that we can use for finding these kind of implicit language by looking at context. So language models are very good at measuring context. And in fact, we've been using this exact same algorithm to quantify anthropomorphism in text. So here's the idea. This is just another paper led by Myra Chung. So imagine you want to know for any given sentence how much you're thinking of an object in that sentence as if it was a person. Like, let's say, how much are we anthropomorphizing a language model, thinking of language models as if they're people, or talking about them as if they're people. Let's take these two sentences. The language model understands how to. We think of that one as being a little more anthropomorphizing intuitively, or the language model is used to, probably less anthropomorphizing. We'd like our measure to reflect that. So we take those sentences, we mask out the entity. So we have a sentence like X understands how to, X is used to, and now we ask for the probability of human versus non-human pronouns appearing in X. So what's the probability of it understands how to versus he or she or so on understands how to? And we take that ratio, probability of a human pronoun versus a non-human pronoun. So how human-like does a language model think the rest of the context is implying about this person, about this entity? And we call that the anthro score. And so this sentence is high in anthro score because language models will tend to fill in this with a he, she, and the other one is low in anthro score because they'll tend to fill it in with an it. And you can then do things like plot the change in anthropomorphization in papers, in NLP papers over time, and you can see them go up sharply. Okay, I want to stop because I'm running out of time. So this is my favorite quote. This is from my recently retired colleague, Herb Clark. The common misconception is that language has to do with words and what they mean. It doesn't. It has to do with people and what they mean. And so I want us to be thinking more. These are applications of NLP, but in general, as we're developing language processing, we should be thinking about the people behind the language. And also very relevant for the workshop, because you guys are doing a lot of projects where there's very interdisciplinary things going on. There's astronomers and there's policy questions from your work. So where are you sending the papers, and how students get papers, and is the paper about the science finding or the method, are things that we've been thinking about a lot, and we could also talk about that in the question session. Okay, I'll stop there. Take questions.
We can do a couple more minutes of questions here, about 10 minutes. I've been lax about passing around the mic in the middle, but we'll try to pass around.
Oh, right, the mic. So, okay, sorry.
Thanks. This is really wonderful. Quick question about the second project here. Did you split the congressional speeches between the House and the Senate? While I imagine that, I'm not sure if all members of the House of Representatives are capable of forming metaphors based on some of the words we've heard. I do wonder if there's more extremism coming from the House, for instance, over the Senate.
In general, yes, I think we did in the supplementary. We did look at House-Senate differences, and there is more in the House. I think that is true, but I don't remember the details.
But still significant in the Senate.
Still significant in the Senate.
Still significant,
disparity in the Senate, yes.
Did a lot of midway questions.
We did a lot of midway questions. You don't have to ask questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Have you looked at some kind of correlation in terms of ethnicity of voter registration per party, in terms of respect or disrespect in these speeches?
Oh, you mean like, do Congress people in districts that have more Italians speak more positively of Italians, or more Chinese speak more positively of Chinese?
Or even in terms of national registration rules? But yeah, I guess it would depend on your.
Yeah, that's a great question. No, that's actually a really great idea. We did not look at that. Yeah, that's cool.
So in the first part, the list of confounding variables, one can keep coming up with things because we're all trying to imagine what the root cause of the
Yes.
problem is and how to fix it. And maybe some people don't believe there's a problem, so they're trying to find another explanation. Did anyone ever ask the officers, confront them with this data and say, why do you think this is happening?
Yeah, in the training yeah, we had conversations with officers. And so let me go back to one of the findings. Oh, let me go out and come back. Oh, is this going to mess me up? I may have to reshare. Oh no, I'm going to have to let me do that. Oh, that's good enough. We'll leave it there. So I mentioned that officers were more likely to give the reason for the stop and more reassurance and more likely to mention driver safety after training. They were not more likely to use sir or ma'am with drivers. And what they told us was that when they disagreed with us on the formal titles, the need for using formal titles, and pushed back. And what they said was, we want to call people bro or boss because it's our way of affiliating. It's a way of affiliating with somebody. Our calling them bro is our way of saying that we're not threatening and we're trying to create rapport. So like there were cases where I think they disagreed with the goals of definitions of what it means to be respectful. But in general, officers said that they were surprised that there was a difference, that they didn't think they were speaking differently to black and white drivers in these other ways, that they didn't think they were giving the reason for the stop less likely or later for black. I forget who I'm talking to, who asked the question. Sorry. Yeah, and so yeah, they were surprised by the facts. Yeah, particularly black officers were surprised by the fact that they were treating black drivers differently. Yeah, Jim.
How do police view escalation? Is it moving towards lack of control, or like what is it that they think of escalation as?
Yeah, we'd like to study this, and like what does it mean to comply, for example? I think the impression we get from talking to police is that police and non-police view compliance very differently. That, for example, police who've talked to us tell us that that people asking questions can be viewed as non-compliant. If you ask a question when you're being stopped, that can be viewed as non-compliant. And I think non-police don't see question asking in general as non-compliant. So there are clearly different perspectives on this whole thing. And so for example, now we're studying driver language. It's going to be really important to not just look at what like other drivers think of driver language, but what police think of driver language. So we're going to get police to label everything that we get other people, because clearly there are two perspectives on this interaction. Yeah.
Great. I think we should make that the last question. So let's end by thanking Dan again.
Thank you. Thank you.